My name is Samuel Henderson. I'm 71 years old, and 3 years ago my own grandfather threw me out of what I thought was his house in the middle of a thunderstorm, calling me a worthless disappointment in front of my entire family. I stood there in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone, watching through the window as my relatives nodded in agreement, thinking I had finally gotten what I deserved after years of what they called freeloading. The lightning illuminated their satisfied faces as they probably thought, good riddance to Sam. You see, for 15 years I'd been living in that old farmhouse in rural Tennessee, taking care of Grandpa Joe, fixing his meals, driving him to doctor appointments, and listening to everyone whisper behind my back about how I was just waiting for him to die so I could inherit something. They saw me as the family leech, the one who never amounted to anything. But what my grandfather and the rest of my family didn't know is that I had an ace up my sleeve that would change everything forever. Listen to this story until the end, and tell me what you would have done in my place. Before I continue with this story that's been eating at me for 3 years now, I'd love to know, what city are you listening from? I always wondered how far stories like mine travel, and somehow it makes me feel less alone knowing folks from different places might understand what I went through. Let me take you back to where it all began, back in 2006, when I was 54 years old and my world fell apart faster than a house of cards in a tornado. I was living in Nashville then, working as a construction foreman, had myself a nice little apartment downtown, and was doing pretty well for a man who never finished college. I'd been married to my sweet Martha for 28 years, and we had 2 beautiful children, David, who was 25 and working as an accountant, and Sarah, who was 23 and teaching elementary school. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I was content. Then came that phone call on a Tuesday morning in October. I can still hear the rain pattering against my office window when my phone rang. It was my cousin Betty, and her voice was shaking like a leaf in the wind. "Sam," she said, barely above a whisper, "it's about Grandpa Joe. He's not doing well. The doctor says he shouldn't be living alone anymore. Now you have to understand something about Grandpa Joe. That man was 89 years old and stubborn as a mule stuck in mud. He'd been living by himself in that old farmhouse in Dickson County for 15 years, ever since Grandma Rose passed. The house had been in our family for 3 generations. His daddy built it back in 1923 with his own 2 hands, using timber from the very land it sat on. I drove out there that same evening, and what I found broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. The man who had taught me how to fish, how to fix engines, how to be strong when life knocked you down, that giant of my childhood, was sitting in his favorite chair, confused and scared. The house smelled like something had been burning, and I found a pot on the stove completely charred black. He'd forgotten he was cooking and nearly burned the whole place down. "Grandpa," I said, kneeling beside his chair, "what happened here?" He looked at me with those blue eyes that used to be sharp as a hawk's, but now seemed clouded and distant. "Sam, is that you, boy? I was making some coffee, but I can't remember." He trailed off, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I looked around that house, the house where I'd spent every summer as a kid, where Grandpa had taught me how to whittle, where Grandma Rose used to make the best apple pie in 3 counties, and I knew what I had to do. "Martha," I said when I called my wife that night, "I think we need to talk." I can still remember the smell of her lavender perfume when I walked into our apartment. She was sitting at our little kitchen table, the one we'd bought at a yard sale when we were newlyweds, and she had that look on her face, the one that meant she already knew what I was going to say. "He can't live alone anymore, can he?" she asked quietly. I sat down across from her and took her hands in mine. They were soft and warm, just like they'd been on our wedding day. "No, sweetheart, he can't. And you know what the family's like. They're all too busy with their own lives to help." And it was true, my father had passed 10 years earlier, and my mother lived in a nursing home in Memphis. My aunts and uncles were scattered across the country, and the cousins who still lived in Tennessee were either too busy with their careers or had their own excuses. Martha squeezed my hands. "So you want to move out there and take care of him?" It wasn't a question. She knew me better than I knew myself after all those years together. "I know it's a lot to ask," I began, but she stopped me. "Sam Henderson, that man raised you when your parents were too busy fighting to pay attention to a little boy. He taught you everything that made you the good man you are today. Of course we're going to take care of him. But here's where the story gets complicated. and where I made what everyone later called the biggest mistake of my life. 2 weeks before we were supposed to move out to the farmhouse, Martha started getting terrible headaches. At first, we thought it was just stress from the big life change we were planning, but then she started having trouble with her vision, and by the time we got her to the doctor, the cancer had already spread through her brain like wildfire. 6 months. That's what they gave her. 6 months to say goodbye to everything and everyone she loved. I spent every day at that hospital, holding her hand, reading her favorite books out loud and trying to memorize the sound of her laugh. Meanwhile, Grandpa Joe was getting worse. Betty and the others were calling constantly, saying he'd wandered off twice, and the neighbors had to bring him home. The choice I faced was impossible: stay with my dying wife or go take care of my failing grandfather. But Martha, God bless her soul, made the choice for me. "Sam," she whispered one afternoon when the afternoon sun was streaming through the hospital room window, "you go to your grandpa. He needs you, and I have David and Sarah here with me, but he only has you. I can't leave you," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "You're not leaving me," she smiled, that beautiful smile that had lit up my world for nearly 3 decades. "You're honoring everything I love about you. Your loyalty, your sense of duty, your big heart. Go take care of him, and I'll be waiting for you." She passed away 3 weeks later while I was 60 miles away, changing Grandpa Joe's bed sheets. I got the call from David at 2:47 in the morning. I can still hear the sound of that old rotary phone ringing in the farmhouse kitchen. I missed saying goodbye to the love of my life because I was taking care of a man who, 3 years later, would throw me out into a storm like I was nothing more than a stray dog. And that, my friend, was just the beginning of this story. Tell me, have you ever had to choose between 2 people you loved when both of them needed you desperately? After Martha's funeral, I threw myself into caring for Grandpa Joe like a man possessed. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the only way I knew how to keep from falling apart completely, but I became his everything: his cook, his cleaner, his driver, his companion, and eventually, his memory. The farmhouse sat on 47 acres of prime Tennessee land, with a creek running through the back pasture, and woods thick with oak and maple trees. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely isolated, which meant when Grandpa started having his bad days, it was just me and him, nobody else for miles around. Those first few years weren't so bad. Sure, he'd forget things, what day it was, where he put his glasses, sometimes even my name, but he still had moments of clarity, where he was the same sharp, funny man who'd taught me how to drive his old Ford pickup when I was 12. I remember one evening in 2008, we were sitting on the front porch watching the sun set behind the hills. He turned to me and said, clear as day, "Sam, I know I'm not easy to live with anymore. I want you to know how much it means to me that you're here." I squeezed his shoulder. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Grandpa." But as the months turned into years, things got harder. By 2010, he needed help with everything: bathing, dressing, eating. The man who had once fixed tractors with his bare hands couldn't figure out how to work a can opener. I watched this giant from my childhood shrink into someone I barely recognized, and it broke my heart a little more every day. The rest of the family started showing up around this time, but not to help. Oh no, they came to check on things, which really meant they came to make sure I wasn't stealing the silver or forging Grandpa's signature on checks. My cousin Betty, who'd made that first phone call, became particularly suspicious. She'd drive up from Nashville every few weeks in her fancy BMW, walk through the house like she was conducting an inspection, and ask pointed questions about Grandpa's finances. "Sam," she said one day in 2011, standing in the kitchen while I was making Grandpa his lunch, "are you sure you're handling his money responsibly? I mean, you never were good with finances." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely untrue. I'd never been wealthy, never owned much more than my truck and my tools, but I'd been honest my whole life. And the suggestion that I might be taking advantage of an old man, especially this old man, cut deep. "Betty, I keep receipts for everything. Groceries, medications, doctor visits. You want to see them? I'm just saying it looks suspicious, you living here rent-free while the rest of us have to work for a living." Rent-free. As if taking care of someone who can't remember your name half the time, who wakes up screaming from nightmares about wars he fought 70 years ago, who sometimes thinks you're a stranger trying to break into his house, as if that was some kind of vacation. But Betty wasn't alone. My Uncle Frank started coming by too, always with his son Tommy, who worked in real estate. They'd walk the property, measuring things, taking pictures, talking about development potential, in voices they thought I couldn't hear. One afternoon I caught Tommy taking photos of the creek and the back pasture. "Planning something?" I asked. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Just, keeping track of the property's condition." "For who?" "For the family, Sam. For when Grandpa died." That's what he meant. They were all just waiting for the old man to pass so they could figure out how to divvy up his land. The worst part was that Grandpa started picking up on the tension. During his lucid moments, he'd ask about the visitors. "Sam, why does Betty keep asking about my papers? And Frank, he's been looking at me like I'm already dead." I tried to deflect, to keep the family drama away from him, but he was sharper than I gave him credit for, even in his declining state. "They think I'm going to leave them something in my will," he said one day in 2013, while I was helping him with his medication. "They think this old house and this land is going to make them rich. Grandpa, you don't need to worry about that stuff." He looked at me with those blue eyes, and for a moment they were completely clear. "Sam, I need to tell you something important, but not now, not when the others might hear." That conversation never happened. The next day, he had one of his worst episodes yet. He didn't recognize me at all and kept asking for his father, who had died in 1965. It took 3 hours to calm him down, and by the time he was lucid again, he'd forgotten whatever he'd wanted to tell me. As his condition worsened, the family visits became more frequent and more pointed. They'd question every decision I made, why I chose one doctor over another, why I bought name-brand medications instead of generic, why I hadn't put him in a nursing home yet. It would be more cost-effective, Betty argued during one particularly heated family meeting in 2015. "And Sam, you could get on with your life." "This is my life," I replied. "He's my grandfather. He's all of our grandfather," Uncle Frank chimed in. "But you're the only one who benefits from this arrangement." Benefits. As if losing my wife, my career, my friends, and my independence was some kind of benefit. As if waking up 3 times a night to help an old man find the bathroom was living the high life. But I stayed because I'd made a promise to Martha, because I'd made a promise to myself, and because despite everything, I loved that ornery old man. The breaking point came in early 2019. Grandpa's dementia had progressed to the point where he rarely recognized anyone. He'd become aggressive, suspicious, and increasingly difficult to manage. I'd been caring for him alone for 13 years, and I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, and spiritually drained. The family started pushing harder for me to make the responsible choice and put him in professional care. And you know what? They were probably right. But every time I started looking into facilities, I'd remember that conversation we'd had on the porch all those years ago, when he'd thanked me for being there. What I didn't know was that while I was struggling with that impossible decision, the family had already made their own plans. And you, what would you have done? Would you have held on to a promise made to a dying wife and a failing grandfather, even when everyone around you was telling you it was time to let go? By the summer of 2019, Grandpa Joe's condition had deteriorated to the point where I was essentially running on fumes. 13 years of round-the-clock caregiving had taken its toll. I'd lost 40 pounds, my hair had gone completely white, and I'd developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Some days I felt older than the man I was caring for. The worst part wasn't the physical exhaustion, though. It was watching the man who had been my hero fade away piece by piece. Grandpa Joe, who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, who had built this house with his own hands, who had taught 3 generations of kids how to fish in that creek behind the house. That man was disappearing, replaced by someone who looked at me like I was a stranger trying to hurt him. It was during one of these difficult episodes in August that everything started falling apart. I was trying to give him his evening medication when he suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Get away from me," he shouted, his eyes wild with fear and confusion. "I don't know who you are. Help, there's a stranger in my house." I'd been through this before many times, but that night was different. Instead of calming down after a few minutes, he became more agitated. He started throwing things, his water glass, his pill organizer, even the framed photo of Grandma Rose that he usually kissed goodnight. "Grandpa, it's me, it's Sam," I kept saying, trying to stay calm while dodging a flying book. "I'm your grandson. I'm here to help you." But he wasn't hearing me. In his confused state, I had become the enemy, the intruder, the threat. He managed to get to the old rotary phone in the hallway and started dialing 911. "There's a man in my house," he screamed into the receiver. "He's trying to poison me. Send help." 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies were at the door, and I was trying to explain the situation while Grandpa Joe hid behind his bedroom door, occasionally peeking out to point at me and whisper, "That's him, that's the one." Deputy Martinez, who knew our situation because this wasn't the first time they'd been called out, was sympathetic but concerned. "Mr. Henderson, this is getting dangerous for both of you." "I know," I admitted, feeling defeated. "I've been looking into memory care facilities, but what?" The truth was, I couldn't afford it. Grandpa's Social Security and pension covered his medical expenses and basic needs, but specialized memory care cost $3,000 a month or more. I'd spent most of my savings over the years, and at 67 years old, I wasn't exactly in high demand in the construction industry. After the deputies left, and Grandpa finally calmed down enough to let me help him to bed, I sat on that front porch until sunrise, wrestling with the hardest decision of my life. Martha was gone, my kids lived their own lives in distant cities, and I was alone with a responsibility that was killing me slowly but surely. That's when I made the phone call that would set everything in motion. "Betty," I said, when she answered on the 3rd ring, "we need to have a family meeting. It's time to discuss your options." Within a week, they'd all descended on the farmhouse like vultures circling a carcass. Betty came down from Nashville with her husband, Robert. Uncle Frank drove up from Chattanooga with his son, Tommy. Even Aunt Margaret flew in from Texas, the first time she'd visited Tennessee in over a decade. We sat around the same kitchen table where Grandma Rose used to serve Sunday dinner, where I'd done homework as a kid, where I'd held Martha's hand when we'd made the decision to move out here all those years ago. Now it felt like I was on trial. "Sam," Betty began, shuffling through a stack of papers she'd brought, "we've been doing some research on memory care facilities in the area." "The Willows in Franklin has excellent reviews," Uncle Frank added. "They specialize in dementia care." "And it's only 45 minutes from here," Tommy chimed in, "so we could all visit regularly." Visit regularly. These people who couldn't be bothered to call more than once every few months were suddenly concerned about visiting regularly. Aunt Margaret, who had barely spoken to Grandpa Joe in the 15 years since Grandma Rose died, leaned forward with crocodile tears in her eyes. "Sam, honey, you've done more than anyone could expect, but this is beyond what one person can handle." I looked around the table at these faces, family, blood, people who should have cared about the old man sleeping fitfully upstairs, but all I saw were strangers calculating dollar signs. "What about the cost?" I asked. "Well," Betty said, glancing at her papers, "Grandpa's monthly income won't cover it entirely, but we've talked to a lawyer about selling some of the back acreage, 20 acres or so. Tommy thinks we could get at least $400,000 for it, which would more than cover his care for however long he had left." They couldn't even say it out loud. "You want to sell part of the property?" "Just the back portion," Tommy said quickly. "The part that's not being used anyway, the house and the front pasture, would stay in the family." "And what happens to me?" The silence stretched out like a funeral shroud. Finally, Betty cleared her throat. "Well, Sam, once Grandpa is settled in professional care, there wouldn't really be a need for you to live here anymore. You could get back to your own life." My own life. After 13 years of sacrifice, of giving up everything to care for their grandfather, they were telling me to get back to my own life. "Where exactly would I go?" I asked. "I gave up my apartment, my job, everything to be here." More uncomfortable silence. Finally, Uncle Frank spoke up. "There are senior communities, Sam. Places where you could afford a small apartment, maybe get a part-time job to supplement your Social Security when you're eligible." They had it all figured out. Put Grandpa in a facility, sell off pieces of his land to pay for it, and send me packing to some depressing senior complex where I could live out my remaining years, knowing I'd failed the 2 most important people in my life, Martha, who'd asked me to take care of him, and Grandpa Joe, who'd trusted me to be there. That night, after they'd all gone back to their hotels, I sat beside Grandpa's bed and watched him sleep. His breathing was shallow and labored, and every once in a while he'd mumble something in his dreams. At one point, he seemed to wake up and looked right at me. "Sam?" he whispered. "I'm here, Grandpa. Don't let them put me away, please. I want to die in my own house." He was asleep again before I could respond, but those words echoed in my head for the rest of the night. Don't let them put me away. How do you choose between what's practical and what's right? How do you balance the needs of a failing mind with the promise you made to a dying wife? I was about to find out that sometimes the choice gets made for you. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a Thursday evening in September 2019. I remember the date exactly, September 19th, because it was 2 days before what would have been Martha's 70th birthday, and I'd been particularly emotional all week. I'd spent the morning at her grave, something I did every year on the anniversary of her birth and death. The headstone was simple, just her name, dates, and the words, beloved wife and mother. I'd brought her favorite flowers, yellow roses, and spent an hour telling her about how hard everything had become. I don't know what to do, sweetheart, I'd whispered to that cold granite stone. I'm losing him, and I'm losing myself, but I can't break the promise I made to you. When I got back to the farmhouse around noon, I found Grandpa Joe sitting in his favorite chair, more lucid than he'd been in months. It was like the fog had lifted from his mind, at least temporarily. Sam, he said as I walked into the living room, sit down, we need to talk. Something in his tone made me pause. This wasn't the confused, frightened man I'd been caring for lately. This was a glimpse of the grandfather I remembered. What's on your mind, Grandpa? He leaned forward in his chair, his blue eyes sharp and focused. I heard them talking the other day. Betty and Frank. They think I don't understand what's happening, but I do. They want to put me away. I sat down across from him, not sure what to say. His moments of clarity were rare and precious, but they were also heartbreaking because they reminded me of everything we'd lost. They think it might be best for everyone, I said carefully. Best for everyone or best for them? He shook his head slowly. Sam, I've been thinking a lot during my clearer moments about this house, about the land, about what's going to happen when I'm gone. Grandpa, you don't need to worry about that. Yes, I do. His voice was firm, determined, because there's something I never told you, something important. That's when he told me about the papers hidden in his bedroom, behind the loose baseboard near the window. Documents he'd had drawn up years ago, back in 2007, just after I'd moved in to take care of him. I saw what you gave up for me, Sam. Your life, your career, your time with Martha at the end. A man doesn't forget something like that, even when his mind starts playing tricks on him. My heart was pounding as I listened to him explain what those papers contained, but before he could finish, we heard the familiar sound of Betty's BMW crunching up the gravel driveway. Quick, he whispered urgently, get those papers. Read them tonight after everyone leaves, but Sam, don't tell them, not yet. Let me handle this my way. Betty walked in without knocking, like she owned the place, followed by Uncle Frank and Tommy. They all had that determined look on their faces that meant they'd made a decision and weren't interested in discussion. Grandpa Joe, Betty said in that overly cheerful voice people use with small children and old people, we've got some wonderful news. We found you a beautiful place to live, with people who can take much better care of you than Sam can. I watched Grandpa's face transform. The clarity disappeared, replaced by the confused, frightened expression that had become all too familiar. But now I wondered how much of it was real confusion and how much was an act. I don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. This is my house. I live here. Yes, you do now, Frank said, pulling out a brochure. But this new place has nurses and activities, and people your own age to talk to. I don't want to go anywhere, Grandpa said, and his distress seemed genuine now. Sam, tell them I don't want to go. All eyes turned to me. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, with Martha's voice in one ear telling me to keep my promise, and the family's voices in the other ear telling me to be practical. Maybe we should discuss this more, I said weakly. Sam, Betty's voice turned sharp. We've discussed this plenty. The decision is made. We've already put down a deposit, and they have a bed available next week. Next week? I couldn't hide my shock. You didn't even ask me. Ask you what? Tommy stepped forward, and something in his expression made my blood run cold. Sam, I think you've forgotten something. This isn't your house. These aren't your decisions to make. I've been taking care of him for 13 years. And we appreciate that, Frank said, but his tone suggested otherwise. But you're not family in the legal sense. You have no say in what happens to Grandpa or his property. That's when it happened. The moment that would haunt me for the next 3 years. Grandpa Joe looked around the room at all of us, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. I don't understand what's happening. Why is everyone yelling? Sam, make them stop yelling. Nobody's yelling, Grandpa, I said, moving toward his chair. but Betty stepped between us. "Actually, Sam, we need to talk about your living situation too." "My living situation?" "Well, once Grandpa is in professional care, there's no reason for you to stay here. In fact, it would be better for everyone if you found your own place." The room went silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, the one Grandpa Joe had built himself back in 1955. "You're kicking me out." "We're not kicking you out," Frank said. "We're just saying that this arrangement has run its course. You've done your duty, Sam. Nobody can fault you for that. But it's time for you to move on." I looked at Grandpa Joe slumped in his chair, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. This was the man who'd taught me how to be strong, how to stand up for what's right, how to protect the people you love. "What if I refuse?" Tommy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then we'll have to involve lawyers, and nobody wants that." "But Sam, let's be realistic here. You have no legal claim to this house or this land. You've been living here as a caregiver, nothing more." That night, after they'd all left with promises to work out the details over the next few days, I went to Grandpa's room and found the papers he'd hidden behind that loose baseboard. I sat on his bed, with the old man sleeping fitfully beside me, and read those documents by lamplight. And as I read, everything changed. But there was something that my family didn't know yet. Something that would turn their carefully laid plans upside down. Because sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who surprise you in the end. The papers I pulled from behind that loose baseboard changed everything. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the legal documents, dated March 15th, 2007, just 5 months after I'd moved in to take care of Grandpa Joe. The first document was a quitclaim deed. The second was a will. The third was a letter in Grandpa's handwriting, though much steadier than his writing had been in recent years. "My dear Sam," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means something has happened to me, and the vultures are circling. I want you to know that everything I'm about to tell you comes from a heart full of gratitude for the sacrifice you've made." I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes. Even in his declining state, even through all the confusion and fear of dementia, part of him had been planning for this moment. The letter continued. "I saw what you gave up for me. I saw you lose Martha while you were here changing my bedsheets. I saw you give up your career, your home, your independence, all to keep a promise to a dying woman and an old man who didn't deserve such devotion." The quitclaim deed was simple and legal. On March 15th, 2007, Joseph Henry Patterson had transferred ownership of the entire 47-acre property, house, barns, pastures, woods and creek, to Samuel James Henderson, for the consideration of $1 and love and affection. The will confirmed it. Everything, the land, the house, even his old Ford pickup truck, had been mine for 12 years. I just hadn't known it. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The final document in the stack was a copy of a conversation Grandpa had recorded on an old cassette tape recorder, dated just 2 weeks ago. During one of his lucid moments, he'd somehow managed to record Betty, Frank, and Tommy discussing their plans for the property. I found the tape recorder in his nightstand drawer and played it back with trembling fingers. Betty's voice came through clearly. "Once the old man is gone, we'll contest whatever will he's left. I mean, what judge is going to believe that someone with dementia made sound financial decisions?" Frank's voice. "And if Sam tries to claim anything, we'll argue that he manipulated a sick old man. Who's going to take the word of a broke construction worker over the family?" Tommy's voice, cold and calculating. "The important thing is to move fast. Get him into care, establish that he's mentally incompetent, and then challenge any legal documents that favor Sam. I've already talked to a lawyer about it." I sat there in that dark bedroom, listening to my own family plot against me, and felt something inside me break. These people had watched me sacrifice everything for 13 years, and their response was to plan how to steal whatever small recognition Grandpa might leave me. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed that a man with dementia couldn't have planned ahead during his lucid moments. The next morning brought the storm. And I mean that both literally and figuratively. The weather service had been predicting severe thunderstorms all week, and by Friday evening, the sky was the color of an old bruise. The wind was picking up, rattling the windows of the farmhouse, and I could smell rain in the air. Around 7 o'clock, the whole family showed up again. Betty, Frank, Tommy, even Aunt Margaret, who I guess had extended her stay to be part of the intervention. They sat around that same kitchen table, but this time there was no pretense of discussion. This was a hostile takeover. "Sam," Betty began. "We've made all the arrangements. Grandpa will be moved to the Willows on Monday morning. You have until Wednesday to pack your things and find somewhere else to live." Wednesday? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're giving me 5 days. It's more than fair," Frank said. "We've even talked to some people about helping you find an apartment in town. Something small, something you can afford." I looked at Grandpa Joe sitting in his wheelchair at the head of the table. He seemed completely out of it, staring at his hands, mumbling to himself. But as I watched, he lifted his eyes to mine and gave me the slightest nod. It was time. "Before we go any further," I said, standing up slowly, "there's something you all need to see." I went to the old secretary desk in the corner, the one that had belonged to Grandpa's mother, and pulled out the manila envelope containing all the documents I'd discovered the night before. "Sam," Betty said impatiently, "whatever it is can wait. We're trying to have a serious discussion here." "Oh, this is serious, all right." I laid the quitclaim deed on the table, right in the middle of all their brochures and legal forms. "This is a deed transferring ownership of this entire property to me. Dated March 15th, 2007, signed by Joseph Henry Patterson in front of 2 witnesses and a notary public." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from Betty's face as she picked up the document and read it. This can't be legal," she stammered. "He has dementia. He wasn't competent to sign this." "The dementia diagnosis didn't come until 2012, I said calmly. "This was signed 5 years before that, when he was of completely sound mind. I have the medical records to prove it." Tommy grabbed the deed from Betty's hands, his face turning red. "Even if this is legitimate, you can't just kick us out of family business. We have rights." "Actually," I said, pulling out the cassette recorder, "you might want to hear this before you talk about rights." I pressed play, and their own voices filled the room. The plotting, the scheming, the plan to contest Grandpa's will and paint me as a manipulator. I watched their faces as they heard themselves planning to steal from the very man they claimed to love. When the tape ended, Uncle Frank was the first to speak. "You can't use that. We didn't know we were being recorded." "In Tennessee, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation," I said. Grandpa consented. "I checked with a lawyer yesterday." That's when Grandpa Joe, who had been sitting quietly through this whole exchange, slowly lifted his head and looked around the table. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, stronger than it had been in months. "Get out of my house." "Grandpa," Betty started, "you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." His blue eyes were sharp, focused, completely lucid. "I understand that my own family has been planning to rob the one person who gave up everything to take care of me. I understand that you've been waiting for me to die so you could fight over my land like dogs over a bone." The transformation was stunning. This wasn't the confused, frightened old man they'd been manipulating. This was the Joseph Patterson who had raised me, who had built this house with his own hands, who had fought in a war and come home to build a life. "Sam owns this house," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Sam owns this land. I gave it to him 12 years ago because he earned it. Because he's the only one of you who ever gave a damn about anything other than what you might inherit." Thunder crashed outside, and the first drops of rain began hitting the windows. "Now get out," Grandpa said again. "All of you. And don't come back unless you're ready to treat Sam with the respect he deserves." Betty was sputtering, trying to find words. "You can't. This isn't. We're family. Family takes care of each other," Grandpa replied. "Family doesn't plot and scheme and plan to steal from each other. You want to know what family looks like? Look at Sam. Look at what he sacrificed." That's when the storm really hit, both outside and inside that kitchen. Frank stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "This is ridiculous. You're sick, Joe. You don't know what you're saying." "I'm sick, but I'm not stupid," Grandpa shot back. "And I'm not deaf. I've heard every word you people have said when you thought I wasn't listening." Tommy was studying the deed again, probably looking for loopholes. "Even if this is legal, Sam has been living here rent-free for years. We could argue that constitutes payment." "Payment for what?" I asked. "For giving up my career? For missing my wife's death because I was here changing bed sheets? For spending my savings on groceries and medications and doctor visits? For 13 years of 18-hour days with no vacation, no sick leave, no help from any of you?" The storm outside was getting worse. Lightning flashed through the windows, followed immediately by thunder that shook the old house. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming against the roof like bullets. You know what? Betty said, standing up and grabbing her purse. Fine, keep your precious house and your precious land, but don't expect us to help when you can't afford to maintain it. I've been maintaining it just fine without your help for 13 years, I replied. One by one they filed out into the storm. No goodbyes, no apologies, just anger and wounded pride. I watched through the window as they ran to their cars, getting soaked in the process. As Tommy's car disappeared down the driveway, Grandpa Joe looked at me and smiled. Really smiled for the first time in months. Sam, he said, I need to tell you something else. Something about the land that those vultures don't know. And that's when he told me about the natural gas rights, about the surveyor who had come out secretly 2 years ago, about the potential that made those 47 acres worth far more than anyone realized. But what he said next was the biggest revelation of all. Sam, Grandpa Joe said as the storm raged outside, his voice still remarkably clear, there's one more thing in that envelope you need to see. I reached into the manila envelope and found a document I'd missed in my initial shock, a geological survey report dated 18 months ago. As I read it, my eyes grew wider with each line. The natural gas deposits under our property were estimated to be worth somewhere between $2.8 and $4.2 million. How did you... I started to ask, but Grandpa held up his hand. Remember my neighbor, old Pete Morrison? His son works for Tennessee Gas Resources. Pete mentioned that his boy had said something about this area being promising for natural gas extraction. So during one of my better days, I called them myself and had them do a survey. I stared at the numbers on the page. Grandpa, this changes everything. It sure does. And the best part? I never signed any mineral rights away when I transferred the property to you. That means you own not just the land, but everything under it too. The irony was almost too much to bear. While my family had been scheming to steal what they thought was a modest farmhouse and some pasture land, they'd actually been planning to steal a fortune. But Sam, Grandpa continued, I don't want you to think this is why I gave you the land. I did that because you earned it, because you sacrificed everything for me. This gas business is just, well, it's like Martha sending you a blessing from heaven. Over the next few weeks, as word spread about what had happened that stormy night, the family's reaction was predictable. Betty hired a lawyer to contest the deed, claiming Grandpa had been mentally incompetent when he signed it. Frank threatened to have me investigated for elder abuse. Tommy spread rumors around town that I had manipulated a sick old man, but their lawyer took one look at the documentation, the medical records showing Grandpa's clean bill of mental health in 2007, the witnesses who testified to his lucidity when he signed the deed, the recording of their own scheming voices, and advised them to drop the case before they embarrassed themselves in court. The natural gas revelation came out during the legal proceedings, and suddenly their tune changed. Betty started calling, leaving tearful voicemails about family forgiveness and working together. Frank showed up at the door one day with a bottle of whiskey and a sheepish grin, talking about misunderstandings and moving forward. I listened politely to their apologies, but I didn't forget. When you hear your own family planning to steal from you, when you watch them try to manipulate a sick old man for financial gain, that kind of betrayal doesn't just disappear because they suddenly realize what they've lost. Grandpa Joe lived for 8 more months after that stormy night. During that time, he had good days and bad days, lucid moments and confused episodes, but he seemed more at peace, knowing that he'd protected the one person who had truly cared for him. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in May 2020, just as the dogwood trees behind the house were blooming. I was sitting beside his bed, reading him the morning news like I'd done every day for years, when I noticed his breathing had stopped. He looked peaceful, finally free from the confusion and fear that had plagued his final years. The funeral was small. Despite all their previous scheming, most of the family had the grace to show up and pay their respects. Betty even delivered a eulogy about what a wonderful man he'd been, though I noticed she avoided eye contact with me the entire time. After everyone left and I was alone in that big house for the first time in 13 years, I felt lost. Taking care of Grandpa had been my entire life for so long that I didn't know who I was without that responsibility. That's when I decided to honor both him and Martha in the best way I knew how. I kept the house and the front 20 acres, the part with the creek and the woods where Grandpa had taught me to fish all those years ago. The rest of the land, the part with the natural gas deposits, I leased to Tennessee Gas Resources for a fair market rate that would provide steady income for the rest of my life. But here's what I did with that money that really matters. I used it to establish the Martha and Joseph Patterson Foundation, dedicated to supporting family caregivers who sacrifice their own lives to take care of aging relatives. Every month, the foundation provides financial assistance to people like I had been, the sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters who give up careers and independence to care for family members with dementia, Alzheimer's, or other debilitating conditions. We help with medical expenses, respite care, and sometimes just basic living costs for people who have chosen love over financial security. The foundation also funds research into dementia care and advocates for better support systems for family caregivers, because nobody should have to choose between caring for someone they love and having a roof over their own head. As for my scheming relatives, life has a way of working things out. Betty's husband Robert lost his job during the pandemic, and they had to sell their fancy house in Nashville. Frank's real estate business struggled when the market crashed. Tommy never did amount to much, despite all his big plans. Meanwhile, I remarried 2 years ago. Her name is Eleanor, and she's a retired nurse who understands what it means to care for others. We met at a support group for family caregivers, and she helped me realize that my life didn't end when my caregiving duties did. It was just beginning a new chapter. We live quietly in the old farmhouse now, tending a garden, fixing up the barns, and hosting the annual foundation picnic every summer. The house is full of life again, laughter, conversation, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the sound of children playing when Eleanor's grandkids come to visit. Sometimes on quiet evenings when we're sitting on the front porch watching the sunset, I think about that stormy night 3 years ago when my family tried to throw me out of what they thought was Grandpa's house. I think about how close I came to losing everything because I trusted the wrong people. But mostly I think about the lesson Grandpa Joe taught me with his final act of love and justice, that real family isn't about blood or inheritance or who gets what when someone dies. Real family is about who shows up when things get hard, who sacrifices for others without expecting anything in return, who keeps promises even when it costs them everything. Grandpa Joe knew that all along. Even through the fog of dementia, even in his confusion and fear, he knew who had truly been family to him, and in the end he made sure that loyalty was rewarded. It's been 3 years now since that stormy September night that changed everything. As I sit here in the same kitchen where my family tried to steal my future, I can't help but marvel at how differently things turned out than any of us expected. The old farmhouse has been restored to its former glory. Eleanor and I have put new windows in the bedrooms, refinished the hardwood floors, and painted the exterior that classic white that Grandpa Joe always preferred. The front porch where he and I used to sit and watch the sunset has been expanded, and we've added a swing where Eleanor and I spend our evenings talking about our days. The creek still runs behind the house, and I still fish there sometimes, remembering the lessons Grandpa taught me about patience and perseverance. The natural gas wells are barely visible from the house, just small installations tucked back in the woods that provide the steady income that funds our foundation work. Speaking of the foundation, we've helped over 200 families in the past 2 years. Every month I get letters from people whose stories remind me of my own. The daughter who quit her nursing job to care for her mother with Alzheimer's, the son who moved back home to help his father with Parkinson's, the grandson who gave up college to care for his grandmother. Each story breaks my heart and fills it at the same time. Last month, I received a letter that particularly touched me. It was from a woman in Kentucky whose situation was almost identical to mine, caring for her grandfather, while the rest of the family pressured her to put him in a home so they could sell his property. Our foundation was able to help her hire part-time respite care, which gave her the break she needed to keep going. "You saved my sanity and probably my grandfather's life," she wrote. "Knowing that someone else has walked this path and survived gives me hope." That's what this is all about. Hope. Hope that sacrifice means something. Hope that love wins in the end. Hope that standing up for what's right eventually pays off, even when it seems impossible. As for my family, we've reached what you might call a cordial détente. Betty and I exchange Christmas cards. Frank nods when he sees me in town. Tommy still avoids eye contact, but that's probably for the best. They know they were wrong, and I know they know, and that's enough for me. The amazing thing about having enough money is that you stop caring about money. I don't need their apologies or their friendship. I have Eleanor, I have my foundation work, and I have the satisfaction of knowing that Grandpa Joe's legacy lives on in every family we help. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear his voice on the wind, saying what he used to say when I was a boy learning to fish in that creek. Patience, Sam. Good things come to those who wait, but better things come to those who never give up. So there you have it, the story of how my grandfather kicked me out of his house, not knowing that I already owned the entire property. But more than that, it's a story about what family really means, about the difference between those who take and those who give, and about how sometimes the people who seem to have the least power are the ones who hold all the cards. I'd love to know what you think. If you were in my shoes, would you have fought back that night or would you have walked away? What would you have done with the foundation money? And please, tell me what city you're listening from. After all these years, I've learned that sharing our stories is what connects us, no matter how far apart we might be. Remember, real family isn't about blood or inheritance. Real family is about who shows up when life gets hard.